To learn new details about a massive multi-agency operation that had one Southeast Houston neighborhood swarming with federal agents.
Yeah, now neighbors in this Clinton Park neighborhood are waking up with questions about what exactly happened and why their community was the focus. KHU11's Devon Raming joins us live now with more on this question.
This story starts with a spreadsheet nobody was supposed to read carefully. Her name was Marshal. She was 31 years old, a junior deputy in the U.S. Marshal Service Southwest Regional Office, based in Phoenix, Arizona. She had been on the job for 4 years. She had come to the Marshal Service the way a lot of her generation had, not through a family law enforcement history, not through military service, but through a graduate program in criminal justice and a persistent belief, unusual for her age group, that the work of finding fugitives who had been formally charged with serious federal crimes was one of the most important things anyone could do with a career. She had been assigned, 6 months earlier, to a records reconciliation project inside the regional office's administrative unit. It was not glamorous work. She was reviewing multi-year fugitive case closure records across the 3-state southwestern border region, Arizona, New Mexico, and Texas, and cross-referencing them against operational apprehension reports, cross-agency intelligence flags, and downstream criminal history databases. The project had been assigned to her because it was the kind of tedious administrative work that senior deputies did not want. It was expected to produce a clean summary report that could be filed and forgotten. On a Tuesday afternoon in late April, Marshal pulled the closure record for a specific fugitive case. The subject was a senior figure inside a major cartel logistics organization. He had been indicted federally 3 years earlier on charges of narcotics trafficking, money laundering, and conspiracy to commit murder in furtherance of a criminal enterprise. He had been placed on the U.S. Marshal Service's Regional Apprehension Priority List. The case had been closed 19 months earlier. The closure code indicated that the subject had been apprehended abroad by an allied foreign law enforcement agency and had died in foreign custody prior to extradition. Marshal did what she had been doing on every other case in her reconciliation queue. She cross-referenced the closure against the corresponding foreign law enforcement records and against the international criminal history databases the U.S. Marshal Service used to verify overseas outcomes. There was no record of the subject having been apprehended by any foreign law enforcement agency. There was no record of the subject having died in any foreign custody. There was, however, a series of intelligence flags in the DEA's cross-jurisdictional monitoring database indicating that the subject had been observed on at least 6 documented occasions across the previous 18 months, meeting with senior cartel figures at properties in northern Mexico and in the Cayman Islands. The man who had been closed out of the U.S. Marshal Service's records as dead was, according to DEA intelligence, alive, active, and operating openly in cartel leadership meetings. Marshal pulled the next 12 closure records in her queue. 7 of them showed the same pattern. If you believe corruption like this should be brought into the light, hit like, subscribe to the channel, and comment "exposed" below. Marshal did not immediately escalate. She did what a junior deputy in her position had been trained to do when she found something that did not make sense. She documented. She pulled the closure records for every high-priority cartel-connected fugitive case that had been closed across the Southwest Regional Command over the previous 9 years. She cross-referenced every one of them against the same downstream intelligence databases. She built a comprehensive spreadsheet, quietly, over the course of 2 weeks, in the after-hours when the regional office was mostly empty. The pattern she assembled was structural. Across the previous 9 years, the Southwest Regional Command of the U.S. Marshal Service had closed approximately 340 high-priority cartel-connected fugitive cases through operational or administrative closure codes indicating apprehension, death, or successful international disposition. Of those 340 closures, approximately 210 showed downstream intelligence indicators that were inconsistent with the closure code. The subjects were still alive. They were still active in cartel operations. They were still moving across borders. They had never been apprehended by any agency, foreign or domestic. 210 senior cartel figures had been quietly closed out of the U.S. Marshal Service's regional pursuit priority while continuing to operate freely. Every one of the closures had been formally authorized under the signature of the same official, the Regional Director of the U.S. Marshal Service Southwest Regional Command. In mid-May, Marshal walked her spreadsheet on an encrypted flash drive into the FBI's Phoenix field office. She did not tell anyone in the Marshal Service what she was doing. By early June, the federal investigation that would take the next 15 months to complete was quietly underway. The regional director was a man named Corbin Vasquez, 64 years old, 31-year veteran of the U.S. Marshal Service, promoted to Southwest Regional Director 11 years earlier, former Field Operations Chief for the Marshal Service's High Threat Fugitive Task Force before that, 2 Federal Law Enforcement Service commendations from the Department of Justice, the kind of senior federal law enforcement figure whose public resume had made him, by every conventional measure, one of the most respected regional command officers in the Marshal Service. For 9 of his 11 years as regional director, he had been operating a parallel case closure structure that ran beneath the formal apparatus of the Southwest Regional Command. Here is how the operation actually worked. The U.S. Marshal Service's regional apprehension priority lists were the operational engine of federal fugitive pursuit. Every senior federal fugitive case, at some point in its life cycle, passed through the Regional Command's authorization structure for case opening, for operational deployment authorization, for coordination with allied federal agencies, and eventually for case closure. Vasquez had been quietly moving specific high-value cartel-connected fugitive cases into a category of closure codes that the operational system treated as low-priority downstream review. Apprehension abroad by allied agencies, death in foreign custody, successful international resolution outside U.S. jurisdiction. These closure codes were, by design, not subject to the same downstream verification as domestic apprehensions. The operational reasoning was that the U.S. Marshal Service did not have the resources to independently verify the outcomes of every allied foreign law enforcement action. Vasquez had turned that operational reality into a laundering channel. For 210 specific cartel-connected fugitives, he had authorized closure codes that removed the subjects from the regional pursuit priority, while receiving compensation from the cartel networks that had wanted those specific individuals off the U.S. Marshal Service's active pursuit list. The subjects were not apprehended. They were not dead. They had been paid for. Combined operational value of the case closure network across the 9-year window, calculated across the cartel operational value of the 210 protected fugitives, the disruption prevented, the continued criminal activity enabled, came out to approximately $1.9 billion. A portion of that value had flowed back to Corbin Vasquez personally through a layered structure of shell companies, offshore consolidation accounts, and physical cash transfers. Vasquez's compensation from the operation had accumulated over 9 years into a substantial offshore consolidation position and, for the cash portion, a physical accumulation at his private compound in the desert outside Tucson, Arizona. Specifically in a hidden bunker built into the compound's foundation 7 years earlier under the cover of a documented private storm shelter installation. The man who had architected the case closure protection layer was a private consultant named Elias Rendlow, 66 years old, former assistant director for international investigations at the U.S. Marshal Service. Before that, 16 years as a senior policy advisor at the Department of Justice on federal fugitive pursuit protocols and cross-jurisdictional case closure standards. Before that, 13 years as a federal deputy marshal with primary responsibilities in cross-border cartel-connected fugitive apprehensions. Elias Rendlow had spent 32 years on the federal side of the U.S. Marshal Service. He had personally written internal Marshal Service guidance on the operational protocols governing international apprehension closure codes. He had testified before congressional committees on the structural indicators federal investigators use to verify overseas fugitive outcomes. He had retired from federal service 11 years earlier. Within 6 months of his retirement, Corbin Vasquez, then in his second year as Southwest Regional Director in the operational planning phase of what would become the 9-year operation, had quietly retained him as a private strategic advisor through a corporate cover called Southwest Federal Operations Advisory, LLC, operating out of a commercial office in Scottsdale, Arizona. Inside the encrypted communications archive that investigators eventually recovered from Rendlow's operational server, his codename was the Marshal. A message in the archive, written 5 years into the operation, read, "Federal fugitive apprehension outcomes are verified against domestic apprehension records. International closure outcomes rely on allied foreign agency reporting, which is not systematically cross-verified. The operational space we are working in is not a gap in the system. It is a load-bearing assumption of the system. The federal architecture was never designed to look at what we are doing, because looking at what we are doing would require rebuilding the assumptions the architecture was built on. Corbin Vasquez held the closure authority. Elias Rendlo had built the system that allowed 9 years of cartel-connected fugitive protection to remain invisible to every federal Marshal Service oversight protocol that had ever been designed to catch it, until Marshal Ganza pulled a single spreadsheet across a records reconciliation project that senior deputies had not wanted to do. The raid happened at dawn. At 4:38 a.m. on a Tuesday in late July, a federal judge in the District of Arizona signed simultaneous search and arrest warrants for 17 locations across Arizona, New Mexico, Texas, and the Cayman Islands. At 5:04 a.m., the order went out. Execute. A 7,800 square foot main residence on approximately 18 acres of private desert property. FBI and DEA tactical teams approached the compound through the main access road and through a secondary tactical entry point along the property's eastern perimeter. The compound's private security personnel, 2 off-duty deputies on personal rotation, were secured without resistance. Federal agents entered the main residence at 5:32 a.m. Corbin Vasquez was inside the residence. He was awake, drinking coffee at the kitchen counter, watching the sunrise through the eastern window. He did not resist. He asked twice whether the FBI had coordinated with the Marshal Service's Office of Professional Responsibility before executing the warrants. The agents confirmed that the operation had been coordinated at the DOJ senior leadership level. Federal engineering teams then proceeded to the compound storm shelter area, which the investigation had mapped extensively during the preceding 15 months through subpoenaed private construction permit records, federal satellite thermal imaging analysis, and subsurface survey data. Beneath the documented storm shelter, behind a concealed hydraulic locking concrete panel built into the shelter's foundation, agents accessed the hidden bunker. The bunker was approximately 1,800 square feet of finished, climate-controlled subterranean space. Inside, agents recovered the following: approximately $54 million in U.S. currency, banded and shrink-wrapped in commercial bank packaging accumulated across the 9 years of the operation. Approximately 96 kilograms of gold bullion, a leather-bound coordination ledger documenting every closed cartel-connected fugitive case, the corresponding cartel side payment, and the offshore consolidation routing across the 9-year window. Financial records covering the full shell company laundering network. Offshore banking documentation tied to accounts in the Cayman Islands, Panama, and the Bahamas. A personal encrypted workstation with active connections to the cartel logistics network's operational infrastructure, and a smaller hidden compartment containing 5 foreign passports, 4 in different names, for Vasquez and members of his immediate family. The private compound outside Tucson, Rendlo's North Scottsdale residence, 4 additional Arizona and New Mexico properties tied to the offshore consolidation chain, and the layered corporate holdings tied to the operation were placed under federal seizure orders. The U.S. Department of Justice announced an immediate operational audit of case closure protocols across every U.S. Marshals Service regional command in the country. The 210 improperly closed cartel-connected fugitive cases were reopened for active federal pursuit within 72 hours of the raid. The Attorney General announced a parallel federal review of post-employment restrictions for senior U.S. Marshal Service and DOJ officials entering private consulting work involving sitting federal law enforcement command officers. The operation had been running for 9 years before Marshal Ganza's spreadsheet was completed. It had survived 9 years of Marshal Service internal audits, DOJ Office of Inspector General reviews, cross-jurisdictional intelligence coordination, journalistic profiles of the Southwest Regional Command, and the careful structural design of a former assistant director of the U.S. Marshal Service who had spent 32 years building the very federal fugitive pursuit framework he was now quietly running operations against. It did not survive a junior deputy who spent 2 weeks after hours in a quiet regional office, cross-referencing closure codes against downstream intelligence databases. The formal reconciliation protocol had not required her to check. If a fugitive protection network this large could operate for 9 years inside the oldest federal law enforcement agency in the United States, allowing 210 cartel-connected senior figures to remain quietly outside federal pursuit while continuing to run their organizations across 2 countries, How many other junior deputies are sitting tonight at how many other regional command offices across the country, doing tedious records, reconciliation projects that senior deputies did not want, and quietly deciding to check the downstream databases the formal protocol has never required them to look at?